Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome to a 1/1000 scale review of a model ship. This, in resplendent diecast by WLTK Weapons Theater, is USS Massachusetts. Battleship number BB-59 Massachusetts is probably one of the most storied ships of the United States Navy, particularly of the World War II era. If you can think of it, Massachusetts most likely did it, including being one of the last battleships involved in a battleship-on-battleship engagement, therefore fulfilling the actual purpose of a battleship. This model is really interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure how to go about crediting whoever actually manufactures it, because there are no fewer than 3 names that I have seen this model and others like it marketed under, which means that trying to find them can be a little interesting, and also trying to figure out where they actually originated is even more murky. But for what it is, for the object that it actually is, it is extremely well done, and it even includes some details that you would not expect to see in this form factor. Again, 1/1000 scale, it is pretty small. However, when you consider that the real-world archetype is literally a battleship, which of course is pretty big, you still have well enough size and proportions here, even at this traditionally small scale, 1/1000. So, let's take a look at this 1/1000 scale model of the USS Massachusetts. We'll talk a little bit about the design, construction, and history of the battleship, as well as survey the finer details on this really fantastic 1/1000 scale model of one of the United States' most storied naval vessels. USS Massachusetts, hull number BB-59. What is she? Why is she significant? How does she fit into the overall history of American battleships, as well as American involvement in the Second World War? Well, Massachusetts, in a nutshell, she is a war-built ship built for the purpose of war. Now, obviously, that would make sense being a battleship. However, she was built, at least her keel laying happened right before the entrance of the United States into the Second World War, a couple of years before actually, but construction did not complete and her commissioning did not occur until well after the United States had entered World War II. So Massachusetts, she had been authorized in the interwar period. Construction began technically in the interwar period as far as the United States were concerned. However, her commissioning and entrance into service very much immediately on a wartime footing. Massachusetts, obviously, she was named for the state of Massachusetts. She was constructed by the Bethlehem Steel Corporation at the Fore River Shipyard in Pennsylvania. Her keel laying occurred on July 20th, 1939. Eventually, she was launched, as in put in the water, on September 23rd, 1941. However, she would not come into commission until May 12th, 1942. So, the keel laying occurring in 1939, actually before the outbreak of World War II officially in Europe. However, her launch date just before the official involvement of the United States in World War II, that of course occurring with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. However, September 23rd, 1941, Massachusetts made it into the water for the first time. Her commissioning, though, would not occur until May 12th, 1942. So, between September 23rd and May 12th of 1942, the United States had officially entered the Second World War, and Massachusetts, therefore, immediately would be pressed into service in that conflict. Eventually, Massachusetts would see service all the way through World War II, but really no time thereafter. Unlike some of the battleships that came after her, Massachusetts and the rest of the South Dakota class really only had careers that encompassed World War II and not much time thereafter. Ultimately, though, Massachusetts would see service in the Atlantic Theater, the North African Theater, technically the Mediterranean Theater as well as the Pacific Theater. So, really, the entire history of the United States involvement, at least from a naval perspective, in the Second World War, can be embodied in the battleship Massachusetts. She saw a little bit of everything, and she was also involved in some very interesting actions, including one very stereotypical battleship-on-battleship action that we will talk about a little bit. Immediately post-war, though, she returned to the United States for a little bit of peacetime stateside service, although she was eventually decommissioned on March 27, 1947. She sat in the reserve fleet for some time. Eventually, though, the Navy said, well, we really have no use for this ship. we probably should get on to disposing of her. Of course, most of the ships built during the interwar period, as well as during the United States involvement in World War II, most of those ships would see the scrapper. However, USS Massachusetts would suffer a different fate. The Navy were definitely looking to scrap her. However, a group of concerned citizens from the state of Massachusetts approached the Navy and said, you know what, we would quite like it if we could have our state's namesake battleship in the state of Massachusetts. And the Navy said, all right, put up the money and we'll give you the ship. So the concerned citizens put up the money, and the Navy dutifully gave them the ship. So USS Massachusetts is one of very few battleships that still exists anywhere in the world. She is currently preserved as a museum ship at Fall River, Massachusetts, at a place that's now called Battleship Cove, where she has resided since August 14th, 1965. So Massachusetts, one of the first museum battleships to come on after the Second World War. Of course, nobody could hold a candle to how old Texas is, BB-35. However, BB-59, USS Massachusetts, she is the first modern battleship to be made a museum, I do believe, and, well, she is still there today at Fall River at Battleship Cove, where she now serves as the centerpiece of a collection of World War II and Cold War era shipping. So if you are in the Northeast, if you're in the Massachusetts area in particular, go see USS Massachusetts and the other ships they have there at Battleship Cove. It's very unique to see a ship of the South Dakota class still preserved today. She's even more unique than the later Iowa class, all four of which that were completed survive today as museum ships. But out of 4 South Dakotas produced, only 2 still survive. Massachusetts and Alabama, BB-60, which is at Mobile Bay in Alabama today as well. The South Dakota class, though, they were the second of 3 eventual classes of fast battleships built for the United States Navy. By fast battleship, we don't mean that they're speedboats necessarily, although they are very fast for ships of this size. However, that is meant as a contrast to the standard type battleships that had existed prior to this. The standard battle line speed, as far as the United States was concerned, was going to be 21 knots. So battleships of that era, particularly of the interwar era, were built to a 21-knot speed in terms of this is the speed that they will be running at in formation in combat. Well, advances in technology, and particularly some advancements that were occurring in the Japanese vicinity as well as the German vicinity, and of course the Brits were a very powerful naval power at the time as well, that was making the United States think twice about a 21-knot battle line speed. So a demand for a fast battleship came in from the United States Navy, and eventually this manifested in 3 different classes. We had first the North Carolina class, followed by the South Dakota class, and ultimately culminating in the Iowa class. The South Dakota class is a bit unique of those 3 in that they are the smallest dimensionally. However, what are the dimensions here on USS Massachusetts? Well, the dimensions and displacement. That's very much dictated not by engineering considerations, but by political ones. After the conclusion of the First World War, the victorious Allied powers came together in London and Washington, and they said, well, we really expended a lot of resources doing this. Can we all agree to disagree for a little bit and stop building capital ships? Or if we are going to build capital ships, can we lay some ground rules in terms of what they're going to be like? So the London and Washington naval treaties came to be, and in a nutshell, amongst a whole bunch of other things that those treaties agreed to, they put limits on the construction of capital ships, battleships of course included. And at the time the treaties were ratified, battleships would have been the center of a naval strike group, task force, flotilla, whatever you want to call a division of ships. Predominantly, there were 2 main constraints that were placed on battleships. One was a displacement limit of 35,000 tons. And second was a limit on main armament. Obviously, it wouldn't be a battleship if we didn't have some big guns someplace on it. And the big guns here on the South Dakota class are 45 caliber, 16-inch main battery guns mounted in 3-gun turrets. Well, all of that is dictated by the treaties. You could have a maximum displacement of 35,000 tons, and you could have a maximum bore diameter on your main battery guns of 16 inches. So, therefore, both the North Carolina and South Dakota classes were built to comply with those limits. Therefore, the displacement here on USS Massachusetts officially 35,000 tons. However, because this ship was coming into service, and really its construction was being completed after the United States had officially entered World War II, once we had proper loadouts with everything, once we had all of the equipment that we really intended to put on this ship installed, the standard displacement raised a little bit to about 38,000 tons. However, under a full load, with full complement of fuel, ammunition, powder, and of course crew, you could have a maximum displacement approaching 45,000 tons. So lots of reserve buoyancy was built into these ships, knowing that there's a good possibility that we're going to have to upsize in terms of the things that we're going to be carrying and fitting aboard. Overall length, 680 feet. The waterline length, though, 666 feet. The South Dakotas are the shortest of the three fast battleship classes. The North Carolina is around 730 feet long, and the Iowas are almost 900 feet long. But the South Dakotas, very compact overall, 680 feet overall length. Beam, very comparable to the other two fast battleship classes, though, 108 feet 2 inches. The beam of a ship is its width, okay? So at its widest point, a South Dakota is 108 feet 2 inches. This was dictated not by treaty, but by the maximum dimensions of the Panama Canal at the time, which was 110 feet wide. The United States is a continental power. It needs to maintain a naval force that can serve both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, meaning that we need to transit the Panama Canal. So don't build a ship that's too big to fit through the Panama Canal, please and thank you. And of course, they complied with that directive with the fast battleships. Draft of this ship, and you can get a sense of the draft by looking at the red section of hull. The draft is how much of your hull is still underwater. Draft 35 feet 1 inch at standard displacement, so about 35,000 tons at that draft level. What do we have powering this thing? Well, this is a steamship, believe it or not. You've got a battleship with big guns and armor and radar and things. You would think that maybe we have some interesting engines. Nope, steam-powered here, but they're turbines. We have 4 General Electric manufactured steam turbines, and they are supplied their steam by 8 Babcock & Wilcox boilers. They are making dry steam at about 550 to 600 psi going into those turbines, and those turbines via gearboxes are driving 4 propellers out the back, 4 screws. They are able, combined, to generate about 130 shaft horsepower, which is good for officially 27.5 knots, which is about 51 kilometers per hour or about 32 miles per hour. In practice, the South Dakotas couldn't really attain their maximum speed because, like their North Carolina class predecessors, they also suffered from vibrations at high speed. So their cruising speed, which is basically where they would be operating for the most part anyway, between 12 and 15 knots, that was okay. But when they really needed to push it up, getting up to that 27, 28 knot limit was a little bit dicey sometimes. Not quite as bad as it was for the North Carolinas, but they did not like to push these ships too hard for too long because of hydrodynamic and resonance problems that they ran into. And we'll see this later on, but they were experimenting with the propeller arrangements here on the South Dakota class all the way through to Alabama, which was the last of the class built, by changing the number of blades on the propellers, and we'll see that a little bit later on. Overall, though, the ship would have had a range of about 15,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. That's 28,000 kilometers, or about 17,000 miles. Crew complement, though. We mentioned that this is the smallest of the U.S. fast battleships, at least in terms of overall length. Displacement, a different number. However, during peacetime, you could expect to see about 1,800 men aboard. That includes all of your officers and enlisted. However, during wartime, and Massachusetts exclusively, for the most part, a wartime ship, that crew size could balloon up all the way to about 2,500. So you have got a space that's 680 feet by 108 feet, okay? And you have 2,500 people occupying that space across 7 decks, 5 of which are really habitable. That's a lot of people in not a very big space. And it's one of the reasons why the South Dakotas did not have a very long service life. However, we'll get back to that. What's protecting this ship? First of all, what can it do on the offense? Well, obviously you can see that we have got some big guns aboard this ship. Those guns are, as we had mentioned, 16 inches in diameter, or at very least the projectiles that they would fire are 16 inches in diameter. They are the .45 caliber Mark VI 16-inch naval gun. Caliber is something very different in naval artillery than it is for, say, small arms. When we talk about caliber in small arms, we're mostly talking about bore diameter or projectile diameter. When we're talking about projectile diameter in naval artillery, we are just going to tell you what the measurement is. It's 16 inches in this case. Caliber, in this case, is an expression of barrel length relative to bore diameter. So in this case, this is a .45 caliber main gun. We mean that the barrel is 45 times more than the bore diameter. So the barrel length here is 45 times 16. That's what we mean by caliber when we get into really big naval gunnery here. But we had 9 of those 1645s in the main battery arrangement here on all of the South Dakota classes, and they are arranged in 3 3-gun turrets, 2 forward, 1 super firing, and then 1 aft as well. Secondary battery armament, though, this is ubiquitous throughout all U.S. fast battleships and several other classes of ships at the time. The venerable 538, the 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun. These guns manually loaded just like the 16-inch battery, however, they are multi-purpose. They could engage surface targets, land targets, as well as air targets to a large extent. They were physically manned by gun crews just like the 16-inch versions, however, they could fire rather rapidly. They could fire a round about once every 3 seconds if you had a well-drilled crew, and the barrels could elevate all the way up to about 85 degrees, so they were effective in an anti-aircraft role as well as an anti-ship and anti-land role as well. Tertiary batteries, exclusively anti-aircraft capacity, though initially the South Dakota class would have been designed to carry the so-called 1.1-inch Chicago piano guns. However, on the North Carolina classes and on the early South Dakota deployments, including on South Dakota herself, the class leader, they ran into numerous problems with that arrangement, so eventually the 1.1-inch batteries were largely replaced with 40mm Bofors guns as well as 20mm Oerlikon guns. And those were 2 guns that remained in service with the U.S. Navy during World War II as well as well after World War II. During their reactivations in the 1950s, the Iowa class in particular were still using both of those guns. Eventually they would be removed after service in the Korean War. However, the South Dakota class eventually became exclusive users of these 40 and 20mm guns. However, the armament is one thing, armor is quite another. Neither could be a battleship if we didn't talk about armor, and the South Dakotas absolutely had a ton of it. The South Dakotas are also somewhat unique among the U.S. fast battleships in that you can at least partially see some of the armor. If you take a look along the side of the ship here, you will see that we have this cutout area. What is this? Well, it's not something exclusive to the South Dakotas. The North Carolinas also exhibit this little cutout, or this step in the shell plating, as I'll call it. The Iowas also have something similar, but it was plated over in that case. So it's most conspicuous on the South Dakotas. What is this? Well, it is a symptom or an indicator of some of the armor that's going on underneath. Main belt armor on the South Dakota class was 12.2 inches of Class A steel. And it was inclined at an angle, I believe around 16 to 18 degrees, something like that. I'm not entirely sure. However, that armor belt and the inclination of that armor belt is part of the reason why you have this cutout in the shell plating there. What you have at the bottom of that cutout are the access hatches for the fuel tanks, and they serve a dual purpose as well. The fuel tanks obviously are holding the fuel, the bunker C, that this ship would have been burning, really viscous stuff that needs to be preheated before it could even be injected into a boiler. However, it also comprises most of the ship's torpedo defense. So basically you have got an armored belt behind all of that shell plating and behind the angled shell plating that is over the top of the fuel tank hatches there, which you can only access from the outside, which probably made some underway replenishment activities pretty interesting, if that was actually ever done for these ships, maybe to a very limited extent. However, behind that you have got your armored belt, and below that you have just got void spaces, which would have been full of fuel or later ballasted out with water as the ship burnt fuel down. Your torpedo defense was your fuel tank. Okay, sacrificial parts, very interesting. However, behind that, you've got your 12.2-inch armor plate. It's got a backing plate, and of course it's angled. The idea is if you've got shells coming in, you're going to be decapping the shells. In other words, you're going to be removing the detonator tip from the shell, which hopefully would trigger a fuse and therefore get the shell to detonate before it fully penetrates your armor and therefore enters the critical spaces of the ship, so you get some more resiliency that way. But you also have the structural support for an area of the ship called the armored citadel. The citadel also contained the following armor allotments. Obviously, you've got your 12.2-inch belt armor. You also have 6-inch deck armor, in addition to the turrets having an armor thickness of maximum of 18 inches, particularly on the turret faces with that inclined armor as well. And that's a partial single plate, partial composite, partial stacking of separate distinct armor plates with backing plates for containing splinters and things like that, but a maximum of 18 inches in the turrets, and a maximum of 17.3 inches in the barbettes. Barbettes are the cylindrical structures that the turrets sit within, and the barbettes enclose the rotating structures of the turrets, 17.3 inches in the barbettes. And the conning tower, which is the space where the ship would be commanded from, at very least during combat, was 16 inches thick. So 12.2 inches of belt armor, 6 inches of deck armor, 18 inches of turret armor, 17.3 inches of barbette armor, and 16 inches of conning tower armor. You've got a lot of protection on this ship. And all of those armored spaces, they collectively comprise the citadel. The armored citadel is the structural core of the ship. The idea of this is effectively what's known as an all-or-nothing armor scheme. This means that all of the critical command, control, and engineering spaces on the ship, so your boiler rooms and engine rooms, your command and control infrastructure in terms of the conning tower as well as a couple other auxiliary steering positions, your steering gear, your shaft alleys for the propellers, rudder posts and things like that. Obviously, your turrets and the barbettes, as well as your magazine spaces for your primary and secondary batteries. They're all contained in this big armored box. You can effectively think of the ship as this rectangular armored structure that comprises all of those areas and materials, meaning that if you had your bow shot away, if you had your stern shot away, if you had most of your superstructure shot away, in theory, all of the armored and protected spaces within the citadel would encompass enough reserve of buoyancy, first of all, to keep the ship afloat, but secondly, would encompass all of your critical spaces to the extent where not only would the ship still be afloat, but it might still be even within the fight. That certainly would have been something pretty interesting to see. Thank heavens we never got to test the theory, but redundancy and protection built into these ships like you would not believe. It is quite the humbling thing to be aboard a battleship and realize just how much steel is surrounding things and how much thought went into allocating where all of those materials were put and why, and the spaces that were within these armored areas. It's pretty remarkable, but that's what these ships were designed to do, and that's what was done here for the South Dakotas. Finally, on the fantail here of Massachusetts, you'll see that we have two fixed-wing aircraft. What are those? Those, in this particular case, are Vought OS-2U Kingfishers. These airplanes were not really meant to be used for defensive or offensive roles. What they really were used for was spotting for the main battery guns. Obviously, the ship itself has several rangefinders, optically as well as radar rangefinders built in. We've got rangefinders in the turrets, we've got rangefinders in the superstructure, we've got radar in the superstructure as well. But you won't always have the luxury of having really good visual conditions all the way out to the horizon, nor will you always have the luxury of having your radar work well, particularly in these days, in the 1940s, very early days of radar. So you've got the reconnaissance planes that you can send out. They can go see, hey, enemy task force over the horizon this way. And then as you start to fire ranging shots, they'll be able to tell you any sorts of adjustments that your fire control guys need to call into the turrets. So that's what those airplanes were used for. I suppose in a pinch, perhaps they could be armed with either machine guns, or perhaps in extreme circumstances you might be able to repurpose some 16-inch main battery shells to be used as bombs to be dropped from those airplanes, but I don't believe anything like that was ever done. So the two aircraft you can see on the fantail here, they are there strictly for a reconnaissance role and for a fire control role. Eventually, roles like that, though, were obviated by advancements in technology, better radar, better optics, as well as really satellites in the modern era that we would be using for fire control in the very limited cases where we still have naval gun usage. Pretty much missiles have supplanted things like that nowadays. But that's what the airplanes were doing here on battleships in the era. Overall service history here on Massachusetts. As we mentioned, she was a war-built ship immediately pressed into wartime service. Her career spanned pretty much the entirety of the U.S. involvement in World War II, and then really not too much thereafter. Immediately after she was commissioned, Massachusetts, after a shakedown cruise in the Atlantic, was sent out over to North Africa in support of Operation Torch, which was the beginning of the Allied invasions of North Africa as they continued to press eastward into the interior of the Mediterranean, eventually to be invading Sicily and the Italian peninsula, as well as in support of landings later on in southern France. However, Massachusetts made it over to Casablanca, where she had probably her most legendary moment, and effectively it was her first real combat engagement. The French battleship Jean Bart had been moored at Casablanca under construction. However, there was at least one operational main battery turret on Jean Bart. Jean Bart was supposed to have an all-forward armament of 8 guns in 2 quad turrets. However, 4 of those barrels were operational on Jean Bart, and I believe they were 15-inch guns. So, from a distance, starting at about 13-14 miles, Massachusetts opened fire with her 16-inch battery on the French battleship, which then returned fire. However, much to the luck of the crew of Massachusetts, no hits really were landed from Jean Bart. Massachusetts, however, eventually managed to land 5 hits on Jean Bart, disabling her and putting her out of action. Didn't sink the ship, but disabled her, made her unable to answer anymore with her main battery armament. And really, it is one of the last examples of battleship-on-battleship combat. So, what this ship really, in essence, was designed to do was to engage enemy battleships. Massachusetts got to do that. It's very unique, especially nowadays, that a ship still exists that actually did what a battleship is stereotypically designed to do, as in engaging enemy battleships. So that was what Massachusetts did on her first real deployment. Talk about being thrown into the fire, battleship-on-battleship engagement. Here you go, brand new ship. And of course, Massachusetts came out the victor from that. After her tour at Casablanca in North Africa, Massachusetts returned to the United States for some minor repairs and some minor refits before she was then shuttled through the Panama Canal over into the Pacific Theater. In the Pacific Theater, she eventually would participate in the Gilbert Islands Campaign, the Marshall Islands Campaign. She was involved in the invasion of Kwajalein. She also made her way over into the Philippines, and eventually she made her way over to Okinawa, where she did some shore bombardment and supported some of the landings there, and she closed out her World War II career in another shore bombardment role, shelling the Japanese island of Honshu toward the end of 1945, or at least toward the end of combat in 1945. She really did get a chance to see all of the major theaters that the United States participated in, at least from a naval perspective. She made it to the Atlantic, she made it to North Africa, she made it through the various island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, and eventually even got within sight of the Japanese home islands. Thankfully, a full-scale ground invasion of Japan, in terms of Japan proper, did not have to happen for the sake of the Allied forces. However, Massachusetts was there, and she would have been there had the war continued past August 1945. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. After the war, she did participate to some extent in Operation Magic Carpet, which was the operation that brought most of our guys back home, and she did go back into service after a brief refit in 1945-1946, pretty much stateside, obviously now in a peacetime configuration. She remained in active duty through the early part of 1947. However, she was eventually decommissioned on March 27, 1947. She sat in the reserve fleet again for a few years before eventually being disposed of as a museum ship at Fall River, Massachusetts. So, basically, from beginning to end of U.S. involvement in World War II, Massachusetts was involved in some extent. Whether she was in North Africa or the Pacific, she was there. Despite all of this, though, despite being one of the last battleships to participate in a battleship-on-battleship engagement, Massachusetts suffered 0 combat fatalities. So for all the action that she saw, for all the places she went, for undoubtedly all of the attacks that she suffered, particularly from enemy aircraft in the Pacific theater, no fatalities related to combat operations. So if you had to go back in time, and if you had to serve in the Navy, you wanted to be in the United States Navy, and you wanted to be aboard USS Massachusetts. So then, what of this as the physical object model that it is? Well, first of all, we are talking here in 1/1000 scale, which you might think is pretty small, and I suppose that, yes, well, it is actually pretty small. We are 1,000 times smaller in all dimensions than the real-world physical object. However, given that that real-world physical object is 680 feet long, well, we're actually pretty good here dimensionally. The ship is about 10.5, 11 inches long and about 1.5 to 2 inches wide. So fairly large in terms of a die-cast model, and the construction is all die-cast as far as the hull goes, with the deck and superstructure being largely plastic, and propellers and rudders also being plastic add-ons. However, macrocosmically here, you can see that we have a very good representation of the overall plan of a South Dakota-class battleship. The shape of the hull is very nice, and the proportion of the hull is very nice as well. Everything looks pretty much correct, and you can even see the distinctive shape of the bow section there of the South Dakota hull, very nicely modeled with the curvature details there as you head aft from the peak of the bow. Also the bulbous bow, or the precursor to what we might now call a bulbous bow, modeled nicely there below the waterline. So really can't fault this from a construction standpoint. It's sturdy, it's put together very well. Things do not move around that should not move around, and by and large, I'm not worried about this thing holding up over time or holding up to handling. So very encouraged by what I see here. However, what is rather interesting to me is trying to figure out who actually makes this thing. I have seen this model and others like it marketed under at least 3 different names that come to mind. I have seen them sold as WLTK. I have seen them sold as Weapons Theater, and I have seen them sold as FLOZ, F-L-O-Z. They are all 1/1000 scale die-cast pre-assembled model ships, just like you see here. And they all appear to be identical in terms of the molding and tooling and in terms of the features. However, I don't know which name is actually appropriate here, which is making it a little bit difficult to research the company or companies that produce these, or where these molds may initially have come from. All I know is that nowadays they are all being produced and sold in China and from China, in the case of where I've gotten this one, had it shipped to the US quite obviously. But whatever the actual name of the company is, they do a really good job on these ships. The fit and finish is really good, and there are even some features here that you might not anticipate seeing on a model this size. Again, 1/1000th scale. However, there are some details and some features here that you might only expect to see from larger scales, say 1/700, another very popular model ship scale. But even from build-it-yourself kits, there are some features in this 1/1000th scale model that you will see that you might only have anticipated on other kits that you are responsible for assembling and painting yourself. So very interesting and very encouraging to see this. Let's delve a little bit deeper into some of the smaller features on this model. As we have now stopped our rotation, let's take a look here at Massachusetts from the port side profile. We'll lower our camera position ever so slightly so we can get down to the bottom of the ship, and you will start to see what comes into play here. Very nice shape of this South Dakota hull from stem to stern. Everything is quite nicely proportioned and quite nicely detailed, as you will see. We even have the bilge keel down there, which is very, very cool. But moreover, we are accurate in terms of the shape and overall proportions below the waterline, which looks very nice and is pretty convincing. Additionally, we have got our propeller mounts, both inboard and outboard props, as well as our twin rudders here on the South Dakota hull. Shape of the stern is accurate as well, as is the way that the hull tapers in above the waterline. Very cool, and very nice detailing as well with the livery here, the camo livery on this ship. Coming back toward the bow, you can see that we have got our flagpole there right at the peak of the bow, as you would expect, in addition to some anchor detailed there, as well as the hull number 59 evident right in there. Really, really cool. That's about as close as we can get before we lose our focus. There we go. Also, we have got either a 20 or 40 millimeter anti-aircraft mount there right at the peak of the bow behind the flagpole. That's cool, and you'll see plenty of that detail as we head on the upper deck here of Massachusetts. Moving aft, coming down off of the forecastle deck there, where we also have anchor chain and windlass detail. You'll see that later on, but we have got our forward main battery turrets here. The 1645s in 3-gun mounts, real nice. You can see the shapes of the turrets are pretty accurately represented, as well are the barbettes. Particularly, you can see the turret 2 barbette, that's the super firing turret. Very nicely modeled, and that's all painted as well. Very cool. There's also, I believe, another 40 millimeter mount on top of turret number 2. As we continue to head aft, you will see here in the superstructure the flared base that you can see just behind turret number 2. That is the armored conning tower, and obviously that is primary con for this ship, but really it was intended to be battle con because that is part of the armored citadel above the main deck. You wouldn't expect to see that generally, but that is part of the citadel above the main deck, and that is where the ship would be commanded from in combat. But really on these ships, as well as on the Iowa class, that turned into the primary conning position, in addition to what is the 05 level on the Iowas, where you have an open bridge where the captain might be conning from in good weather. But really cool detail in the superstructure as well. You can see on the main deck, as well as part of the 01 level, which is the first level above the main deck, you can see that we have got some porthole detailing in there. Very, very impressive to see that on a scale this small. Again, 1/1000th scale. Each porthole that you can see is really only about a millimeter or so in terms of its diameter. So the fact that they're modeled here at all, and they are actual perforations, they are not just black specks of paint, that is really remarkable. Additionally, you can see all of these smaller turret structures right through here. Those are part of the secondary battery. Those are the 5-inch 38s. Obviously, the turrets here are all shown trained forward, but these turrets, in theory, could pivot 360 degrees in any direction. And the barrels of those guns could obviously elevate to a maximum of 85 degrees for tracking aerial targets as well. So real cool stuff. If we move upward a little bit, you will start to see the upper parts of the superstructure and the masts here. You can see, obviously, back forward on the conning tower, we have got the radar arrays, as well as optical rangefinders and periscopes as part of, first of all, navigation, but also part of the rangefinder suite for the main and secondary batteries. Just after that, we have got this structure right here. That is one of the fire control directors exclusively for the secondary battery, for the 5-inch 38s. All of the systems here could be cross-connected and redundant so that the secondary directors could control the main battery guns and vice versa, but of course all of this stuff built into the redundancy in terms of protecting the ship should systems start to be knocked out in battle. Up to the top of the superstructure, you can see this structure right here. This is what we call SPOT, the main battery fire control directors. These are optical range finders. Spot 1 is the highest point of the ship, right on top of the roughly pyramidal main mast of the ship. And Spot 2 is a similar rangefinder right here in the after part of the superstructure. So main battery fire control referred to as Spot, secondary battery fire control referred to as Sky. Obviously we have got one of those secondary battery directors here. We've also got another one right here. We have got one aft of Spot 2, a bit lower down, and there is another one on the starboard side of the ship as well, complementary to the port side position that we can see. So we've got 4 Sky directors, and we have got 2 primary Spot directors. However, part of the conning tower, the upper level of the conning tower, was called Spot 3. That was a reserve position for directing main battery fire should you have an issue with Spot 1 or Spot 2. So real cool and really amazing to see this detail in the superstructure. Also evident here in the superstructure, you can see the funnel right through here. The South Dakotas are unique among the American fast battleships in that they were the only class to have a single funnel. All of your uptakes from the boiler rooms all being trunked into a single exhaust, and it terminates here in the funnel in the after part of the superstructure on Massachusetts, and all of the other South Dakotas were equipped in exactly the same way. So one of the ways that you can very quickly distinguish a South Dakota from an Iowa, because they are very similar in other respects visually, is to take a look at that funnel. South Dakotas only have 1, the Iowas have 2, and the North Carolinas also have 2, but North Carolinas are very different looking ships anyway, so that's real cool. Moving toward the rear of the main deck here, the after portion of the main deck, what do we see? We see that we have got turret number 3 with another anti-aircraft mount on top, again either 20 or 40 millimeter guns. And then aft we have got more anti-aircraft mounts on the deck itself, in addition to our catapults for our Kingfisher spotting planes. So really cool detail to be taken in here just from the port side of the ship. Really nice to see. And again, this is 1/1000th scale from a company that I'm not even entirely sure how to name, but they have done a fantastic job nonetheless. Coming in directly bow on to Massachusetts, and here you can really see the proportions of the overall hull form. Obviously, for hydrodynamic reasons, we have got the hull tapering to a fairly sharp point here at the bow, and that's augmented by the bulbous bow below the waterline. However, above the waterline, you can see just how thin everything becomes right there toward the peak of the bow. This is obviously to reduce the really friction, but overall water resistance as the ship builds up speed. The less surface area frontally that you're presenting into the water column, the less resistance you're going to have, which means the more efficient your ship's going to be, and really, in theory, the faster it's going to be. Fast battleship, after all, needs to be hydrodynamically designed, and the South Dakotas certainly were. Also from this view, you can see the overall proportion of the main battery armament, at least forward. You can see that there, really nice. And then beyond that, you can see how the hull flares out port and starboard as we start to get up to the 108-foot 2-inch width of the ship in total. You can also see from this angle we have got the 2 steps either side of the hull. That is the tank top, the tops of the fuel tanks anyway, and obviously you've got your angled belt armor behind all of that shell plating, but real cool. You can also see from this angle that we have got the secondary battery turrets, the fronts of which are visible there, at least 2 of them on either side. And you can see in proportion how they are positioned along the upper hull relative to each other. Moving forward, or moving aft, but moving in from our perspective here, if we can get a focus on things, which we are not. There we go. Almost. You can see behind turret number 2 and its anti-aircraft mount, you can see the armored conning tower right there. You can even see that they have bothered to put in detail of the view slits in the conning tower. Again, this is 16 inches of single plate cast armor on this South Dakotas anyway. The Iowas had 17.3 inches, so even thicker than this. But part of the outfitting of these components was to cut these view slits out, so first of all you could kind of see where you were going, but really it was for ventilation. They bothered to model that in 1/1000 scale. That's absolutely ridiculous, but it's a detail and it's there. You can also now see the 2 secondary battery fire control directors right here on either side of the main area of the superstructure. And then across the top there you can see we've got a radar dish, and just below that you can see this Y-shaped structure, this T-shaped structure. This is the rangefinder for Spot 1 right on top of the superstructure. Again, the idea of putting your rangefinders up high is they have the longest view away from the ship. In optimal visual conditions, the horizon, at least your visible horizon, is only going to be about 10 to 15 miles away. When you have main battery guns that have a range in excess of 20 miles, as was the case here on the South Dakotas, you need to see a little bit farther away. In other words, you need to move your horizon out. So the higher you go, the farther you can see, again, depending on visibility conditions. But in general, the higher you are, the longer distance you can see, which means put your rangefinders as high as possible. That's why Spot 1 up top there would be your primary rangefinder. Spot 2 mounted lower down would be your backup. Ideally, both would be tracking targets at the same time. However, if one goes down, you've got the other as backup, and you've even got Spot 3 as backup as well. But really cool proportions and really cool detailing to see here just from this bow-on view. From the starboard side, very similar, of course, to what we would have seen already from the port side. However, going back down to take a look below the waterline, there you go. Very good detailing here on the starboard side as well. Pretty much everything is mirrored because, well, the ship is built symmetrically, of course. You can see there, hull number 59, and we've got anchor detail, at least attempted. Good enough, I've got to say. It looks like an anchor. It's not a separately applied piece, but it looks good nonetheless. The little anti-aircraft mount right at the peak of the bow, though, makes up for that, in my opinion. Moving aft, you can see we do have a little bit of a paint flaw right here. I didn't do that. The ship came that way. Perhaps we can say it's splinter damage from Jean Bart, but it doesn't really detract from the appearance of the ship as far as I'm concerned, and to touch it up would just ruin things further, so I'm leaving it there, and again, it doesn't look all that bad. But again, on the main deck, you can see turrets 1 and 2 looks good, and then again, you can see we have got that porthole detailing there in the 01, 02, 03 levels as well. Really, really remarkable to see that, in addition to the starboard side complement of secondary battery 5-inch guns. Very, very cool. Additionally here, this is something that we did not have on the port side. You can see that we have got this crane right here. This crane was there in some cases, to help lift the spotting airplanes out of the water, because obviously they couldn't land on the deck of the ship. They'd have to land in the water, and then the ship would come alongside and pick them up. That crane could be used to do that. The crane could also be used just for loading, unloading operations. Lots of heavy things would be loaded onto a battleship, namely ammunition, and of course food and other supplies for the crew. So you've got a loading crane to help support all of that. Immediately behind the crane is Spot 2. So real cool. Obviously, you've got your view of the funnel, and then the main mast with the U.S. flag. Very nice. Moving aft, there's Spot 2. There's Sky, one of the Sky directors, Sky 4, I believe that is. And then, obviously, you've got turret number 3 with your anti-aircraft mount on top. Those anti-aircraft mounts on top of the turrets would have been a place to be, I'll tell you that much, especially if you've got the 16-inch guns firing while you're on top of them. That must have been absolutely wild. I know that immediately ahead of the main guns, when they would fire, you would have a relative overpressure in excess of 50 psi. I believe on the 50 caliber Mark 7 guns used on the Iowas, I believe it was closer to 60 psi overpressure. A slightly larger charge from the 50 caliber versus the 45 caliber, but that is well enough to kill someone instantly if they are hit without protection just from the overpressure, never mind the actual projectile. However, behind the muzzle, the overpressure is very insignificant, so it would still be quite loud to be there, but you're not going to be injured, apart from repeated exposure could well give you hearing loss. But still, that would be absolutely spectacular to be right there as those big guns were firing. Of course, it would be quite bright as the powder is going off, because the muzzle flash from these guns would have been significant. So I don't know, perhaps you'd want some sort of eye protection as well. But yeah, it had to have been quite the thing. And then, of course, you have the added benefit of having a bird's eye view of everything going on around you, including the most likely Japanese airplanes that are coming in trying to strafe you. So yeah, probably not the most privileged seat to be in, because you have effectively no protection. But it must have been a sight nonetheless. Of course, coming through the fantail, there's our hull number again on the starboard stern, and then we have got our skegs mounting the outboard propellers, and of course our rudders are there as well. Also the starboard bilge keels visible quite plainly, as is the step in the shell plating there, which more or less encompasses the length of the Citadel. Not quite. The Citadel would extend all the way up through the barbette of turret 1 and then through the barbette of turret 3, but for the most part you can see just generally where the Citadel boundaries are just by getting a look at the step there in the shell plating. But yeah, not too bad, I've got to say. And a view from the stern here on Massachusetts, and here's where you can start to see some more of the details coming underneath, in particular how our propellers are set up. You can see that we have got 5-bladed propellers on the outboard skegs, and we've got 4-bladed propellers on the inboard skegs, so 4 screws in total, of course. This was something that they were continuing to experiment with here on the South Dakotas, even in the late stage of development. Massachusetts and Alabama, hull numbers 59 and 60, they were the last of the class built, and they still were trying to figure out what is the ideal arrangement, because you had vibrational issues that were plaguing this general design of ships going all the way back now through the North Carolinas. However, eventually they were sorted for the Iowas, more or less. Still some lingering issues at times for the Iowas, which had a very similar propulsion layout, but still experimenting with this here on Massachusetts all the way at the end of the development cycle for the South Dakota class. So pretty interesting to see all of that. However, you also got the proportion here of the stern. You can see how the hull tapers back in towards centerline back here. This is partially for hydrodynamic reasons and partially just because it's the way that the structure of the ship needs to come together back here. You can see the proportion of the 2 airplanes mounted on their catapults, and then just after the airplanes you can see on the centerline we have got a crane. This crane would also be used for recovering the airplanes after they land in the water and come alongside the ship. And additionally, you can see that we have got 2 more anti-aircraft mounts right aft here at the stern. So very, very cool. You can see along the sides, you can see the proportions of the bilge keels, the after bilge keels anyway, and not quite visible from here are the steps in the shell plating, but real cool to see all of that. And of course you can see the overall proportion of the superstructure from the aft. It's one of those stereotypical views of a battleship, and you know, you see this on the horizon, you immediately know at very least what type of ship you're looking at. Especially on hazier days, longer distances, you see that roughly triangular shape on the horizon. Yeah, you know that something out there means business. Going freehand now to take a look at some of the smaller features here, particularly those features visible on the main deck on this 1/1000th scale model. Again, I keep reminding you that this is a 1/1000th scale ship because of the level of detail here. It's pretty remarkable, as you can see. First of all, you can see the windlasses, wildcats, and anchor chains here evident here on the forecastle. Anchor chains are a raised detail. They are molded into the plastic deck, but they are painted separately, as you can see, as well as are some of the hatch covers there. That's really cool. The anti-aircraft mounts there at the peak of the bow, they are also separately applied details, and as we come down you can see that. Yep, they are freestanding, separately applied details. That's really remarkable. Additionally to that, you can see the capstans, you can see some covers for ventilators right up there at the top, and of course we have got the breakwater ahead of turret number 1. Another separately applied detail, and it looks really, really good. Behind the breakwater you can see some more deck details. I believe we have got representations of paravanes. The paravanes were these devices that would have been linked up to chains, and they would have flown under the water, being towed by the ship, and they were there to cut the mooring lines for undersea mines. So really cool stuff. And then obviously we have got the main battery turrets here. There are a couple really cool features about the main battery turrets. First of all, they rotate, as you can see. So even in this very small scale, we get turrets that can rotate. It's a little difficult to do one-handed here on turret number 2, so we won't really play with that too much. But turret 1 is rotating pretty nicely, so you can see that we have got this feature. It looks really, really cool. However, in addition to rotating, the turrets also can elevate their guns. They can't elevate all that much, but the fact that they elevate at all in a 1/1000 scale model is really, really remarkable. So, yep, main battery turrets, they can train and they can elevate. So really, really cool stuff to see right there. And you can just see how small they are as I manipulate these things. But there it is. Obviously, turret number 3 also has the capacity to elevate as well as to train. Again, not the easiest thing to do one-handed right now, but yeah, there you go. And the gun barrels of turret 3 can elevate as well. So really, really cool to see that. And again, 1/1000th scale. I would expect to see that at 1/700, but 1/1000, that's really pushing it. But there it is. These guys absolutely delivered. Taking a look here across the main deck and superstructure from another angle, more anti-aircraft mounts, more deck hardware. You can see the main deck in 01 level there, and then we get into the real superstructure. You can see the cutouts there around the 5-inch mounts in the forward superstructure. You can see the bridge, navigation bridge there, the conning tower below and around it. And then, of course, your periscopes and your directors for the secondary and primary battery up top here. But really, really remarkable to see that this level of detail is available on a model this size. Additionally, you can see one of the ship's boats. That's another use for the crane here in the aft starboard superstructure. So again, you've got the boat, the crane. Again, all of this detail, things that you would not fault them for omitting, but they included it. The portholes continue all the way up to what I believe is the 011 level, where you would have more spotting positions. And beyond that, you would have had probably another conning position, probably at the 08 level as well, which I also believe is represented at least partially. Very cool. Top of the platform with the radar array and radio antenna, and then of course your main mast with the US flag. There are not 50 stars on it. I don't know how many stars there are on this particular representation, but it's recognizable as for what it's supposed to be anyway. The funnel, you can see the rather unique shape of the South Dakota class funnel. It's not just a circular shape. It's not a cylinder, really. It is this truncated triangular shape, which is really cool. But they have bothered to include the grating there. And then, of course, down through the trunk of the funnel, there would be armored grates in there as well. That's not represented because all that would have been inside the ship. There's Spot 2. There's Sky 4. More anti-aircraft mounts, and then turret number 3, which we already demonstrated can rotate and elevate. More of the ship's boats, more anti-aircraft mounts, and then the ship's spotting aircraft. Really, really, really cool. The catapults that the airplanes are mounted to, those are not steam catapults like you might expect to see on aircraft carriers today. Those were powder actuated. There would be an explosive charge that would be placed behind the airplane, behind the shuttle on the catapult, and that would be detonated, and the airplane would be shot off basically like a gun. So that had to be an exhilarating launch experience. Although concurrently, you could also lower the airplane into the water and have it take off from the water, but that was not something that was generally done, I am led to believe. But just really looking at this as the completed piece, it is just an amazing thing that you get this amount of detail at this very small scale. And one more thing that we should take a look at, the propeller arrangement here. We have got 5-bladed outboard propellers and we have 3-bladed inboard propellers. So again, this was something that the Navy continued to experiment with all the way through the end of development on the South Dakota class. And Alabama, the last of the class, would have had a different arrangement here. But here on Massachusetts, 3-bladed center props and 5-bladed outboard props. Real cool stuff. Then of course coming around the side of the ship, there's the curve of the hull inboard toward the bow. Really, really cool to see all of that. And again, this is 1/1000 scale. It's so cool, and really, I wish I knew the proper name of the company, because they deserve a lot of credit for what they have done here on this model. It really does look absolutely fantastic from all angles. So there she is, in 1/1000 scale by WLTK Weapons Theater, USS Massachusetts, BB-59, one of the most storied and venerable battleships in the history of the United States Navy, and really in the history of battleships in general. If you can think about it, Massachusetts most likely did it at least once, whether it was her battleship-on-battleship engagement with Jean Bart, or her participation in the Pacific Theater in the various island-hopping campaigns, to her support of the liberation of the Philippines, to her support of shore bombardment off of Okinawa as well as off of Honshu, to her being on station for the duty of supporting a full-scale ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, should that have occurred. Massachusetts was there. She also played a role in bringing Allied forces back home from the Pacific Theater after the conclusion of hostilities, and she continues to serve a purpose today, not as razor blades, but as a public museum in Fall River, Massachusetts, where to this day you can still visit the venerable Big Mamie, as she was affectionately known by her crew, where she continues to educate and even to entertain in some regards, because it's a really cool thing to be able to say in 2023, hey, I've been on a battleship. Well, you can go ahead and be on a battleship at Battleship Cove, Fall River, Massachusetts, where you can see the eponymous USS Massachusetts, still in her glory, maintained and continually restored by a team of staff as well as volunteers over at Battleship Cove. She is a tremendous sight. I hope one day to be able to see her for myself, but for the moment, pictures will have to suffice, as well as this 1/1000 scale model by WLTK Weapons Theater, which really is a fantastic piece that I am very happy to have in the collection. If you're considering model ships, battleships in particular, definitely take a look at these guys, because despite the confusing name or names that the companies or company may have, it's a very good product, surprisingly good in terms of the detail that's evident. Die-cast construction throughout the hull, plastic add-on details that are all separately applied. You've got rotating and elevating primary battery turrets. At 1/1000 scale, I don't know how you beat that. I definitely didn't expect to have rotating turrets at all, never mind the fact that the guns elevate. So it's really fantastic to see all of that. It's authentic, I've got to say, in terms of the overall shapes and proportions of everything. I've looked at many a picture of a South Dakota class battleship, and this really does look the part. So very much recommended. If you are in the market for model ships in 1/1000 scale, take a look at WLTK Weapons Theater. I don't think you'll be disappointed by them. Until next time, though, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.